The most feared man in the city had survived 3 assassination attempts, 2 federal indictments, and a war that left the harbor running red, but he'd never once been stopped by a woman with empty hands and a child's drawing folded in her coat pocket. Maeve Donnelly was 27 years old, a slight frame worn down by exhaustion that used to belong to an emergency room nurse before the system decided she was disposable. She'd lost her license to a lie she couldn't disprove, lost her marriage to a man whose fists spoke louder than his apologies, and she was 3 weeks behind on the rent for an apartment that smelled like mildew and other people's cooking. Her daughter Greta was 5 years old, with a heart that beat wrong, a small broken rhythm that doctors said would stop for good unless someone found $40,000 that Maeve would never see in this lifetime. So she scrubbed office floors at night and carried plates by day and made herself invisible, because invisible was safer, because nobody hurts what they can't see. That was the rule that had kept her alive, and she broke it on a gray Tuesday morning at the corner of Halsted and Quincy, when she stepped off the curb into the path of a black armored Escalade carrying Connor Fallon, the man who owned half the docks, all the wrong people, and a heart that had stopped feeling anything 6 years ago when a car bomb took his wife and his little boy and left him alive to rule what remained. He was 37, silver already threading through dark hair, dressed in a charcoal suit that cost more than Maeve earned in a year, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who'd buried so much of himself that cruelty came easier than mercy. His men carried guns, his enemies carried grudges, and nobody, in 6 years of his reign, had ever been stupid enough or brave enough to stand in the middle of the street and refuse to move. But Maeve had seen something the night before, in a parking garage, beneath a tower owned by the kind of money that doesn't get its hands dirty. She'd seen 2 men in technicians' coveralls reach beneath the front wheel, of that very Escalade, and clamp something there. Something clean, something deliberate, something she recognized from the worst nights of her old marriage. She didn't know whose car it was. She didn't know it would matter. She only knew, standing on that freezing corner watching it roll toward the light, that if she walked away, people were going to die, and she'd spent her whole life walking away from people who needed her. Not this time. So she raised both hands and stepped into the path of the most dangerous man in the city, and he looked at her through bulletproof glass like she was nothing, like she was no one, like she was already a body in the road. He had no idea she was the only reason he'd lived to see noon, and he had no idea that the woman he was about to threaten, interrogate, and underestimate had already crossed paths with him once before, on the worst night of his life, in a way neither of them would remember until it was almost too late. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been the person nobody bothered to see, then stay with me, because this one's for you. Hit that like button, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story. Now let's get back to that frozen corner, where a broke Singh's mother is standing in front of a killer's car, and neither of them knows that the next 60 seconds are about to change everything. The Escalade stopped less than a meter from Maeve, its glossy black hood throwing the engine's heat against her 2 trembling calves, and for one suspended moment she heard the brakes scream like a strangled cry in the mute morning air. Then everything shattered all at once. The rear door flew open. 2 men in black suits rushed out with the clean, decisive movements of men who had done this hundreds of times before, and before Maeve could lower her hand, she saw the dark mouths of 2 guns aimed straight at her chest. "Get on your knees. Hands behind your head, now," one of them barked, his voice not loud, but carrying the weight of an order that was used to being obeyed. Pedestrians on the sidewalk scattered like water meeting oil. Some pulled out their phones, some simply lowered their heads and hurried faster, because in this city everyone had learned that there were certain things it was better not to see. Maeve didn't kneel. Her legs were too exhausted to kneel, and some part of her knew that if she went down now, she would never be able to say all that needed to be said. "Under the car," she said, her voice breaking on the first word before she forced herself to stay upright. "There's a bomb. I saw someone attach it last night, under the front right wheel. Don't let the car keep going." One of the 2 men glanced at his partner, the corner of his mouth bending into something that was half mockery and half caution. "An addict," he muttered, "or someone sent by somebody else to stall us." Inside the vehicle, behind bulletproof glass as thick as a wall, Connor Fallon didn't move. He sat back against the leather seat, one hand resting loosely on his knee, his eyes studying the woman through the glass, as if he were looking at a stain someone had forgotten to wipe away. He had seen every kind of trick in 6 years of ruling, every kind of trap disguised beneath a harmless face, every kind of person sent to make him stop at the exact second when he shouldn't stop. A thin woman in a worn coat, with dark circles under her eyes, standing in the middle of the street during rush hour shouting about a bomb. That was exactly the kind of thing his enemies would stage. "Get her out of the way," Connor said into the radio clipped at his collar, his voice flat, and so cold it didn't need to be loud. "We're late." The man sitting beside him in the back seat didn't obey at once. Arthur Hale was 58 years old, with neatly cut silver hair and a face marked by the deep lines of a man who had spent his whole life watching instead of being watched. And in 30 years standing beside the Fallon family, he had learned something bullets could never teach: how to tell the difference between a liar and a person terrified because of the truth. He wasn't looking for the bomb. He was looking into the woman's eyes, and what he saw there wasn't the calculation of someone setting a trap, wasn't a sideways glance waiting for a signal, wasn't the restless tension of a person performing a role. She was staring straight at the vehicle, at the place where she knew someone was sitting, though she had no idea who he was, with the desperation of a woman who had decided to trade the only thing she had left, her own life, just to say the thing no one wanted to hear. Arthur had seen that look once, a very long time ago, on the face of a young soldier running back into a burning building to pull his comrades out, and he had never forgotten that people with that look almost never lied. "Connor," Arthur said softly, without turning his head. "Wait." Connor glanced at him, his brows drawing together into one sharp line. In 6 years, Arthur had rarely challenged an order, and every time he did, there was a reason Connor only understood later. "She's stalling," Connor said. "Maybe," Arthur replied, his eyes still fixed on the woman through the glass. "Or she's telling the truth. And if she's telling the truth and we let the car move, then the man who wins today won't be you." Outside, Maeve was still standing there, her hands hanging at her sides, trembling but not stepping back, not begging, only repeating in a voice gone hoarse from cold and fear, "I don't need you to believe me. Just look under the car. 1 minute. If I'm wrong, you can do whatever you want to me." Standing in the thick silence settling over the intersection, she could feel the scales beginning to tilt, a single strand of hair swaying between life and death, and she didn't know which way it would fall. Connor looked at her for 3 more seconds. Then, without taking his eyes off the strange woman's face, he touched the radio a second time and said one single sentence that made everyone freeze. "Check underneath," Connor said. The 2 words fell into the air like stones dropping onto still water, and for one brief moment, no one in the convoy believed what they had just heard. One of the bodyguards aiming his gun at Maeve blinked, turned his head toward the vehicle as if to confirm it, then received Arthur's dry, curt nod through the narrow gap of the half-opened door. "You heard him," Arthur said. "Under the car, front right wheel, quickly." The machine of power that had always operated with smooth precision suddenly came to a halt, and Maeve saw something she had never imagined she would see, a flicker of hesitation on the faces of men who were used to giving orders, not receiving orders wrapped in doubt. One man dropped to his knees beside the vehicle, pressed his cheek close to the cold, wet pavement, and swept a small flashlight into the darkness beneath the undercarriage. For a few seconds there was nothing but the sound of his own breathing and the low murmur of the engine above him. Then he shot to his feet, his face paling beneath the gray morning light, and when he turned back toward the vehicle, everyone else understood before he could even open his mouth. "It's real," he said, his voice thick and hoarse, with not a trace of mockery left in it. A block, magnet-mounted, fresh wiring, clean, professional, not homemade. Silence poured down over the intersection once more, but this time it was different, denser, heavier, carrying the weight of a truth that had just torn through the skin of suspicion. The man who had knelt beside the undercarriage stepped back several paces, as if simply standing near that device was enough to burn him. The other 2 men slowly lowered their guns, not because they had stopped being cautious, but because for the first time they weren't certain who they were supposed to be cautious of. And inside the vehicle, Connor Fallon sat upright. For 6 years, ever since the night an explosion stole everything that remained of his heart, countless men had wanted him dead, countless traps had been laid in the dark, and he had survived every one of them by never trusting anyone, never stopping, never letting emotion slip into the narrow space between himself and a decision. But that morning, a woman he had never met, someone who had no reason to risk her life for him, had stood in the middle of the street and handed him back a morning he wasn't supposed to have. He pushed open the car door and stepped out, not hurried, not panicked, only the slow, controlled movement of a man who had grown used to turning fear into stillness. He stood there, tall and broad in a charcoal suit, his breath turning to white smoke in the cold air, and for the first time he looked directly at Maeve, not as if he were looking at a stain, not as if he were looking at a body in the road, but as if he were looking at a question he didn't yet know how to answer. Maeve looked back at him. She didn't know who this man was, didn't know how much blood and how much fear the name Connor Fallon carried through this city. She only saw a man with the eyes of someone who had buried too many things inside himself, and she recognized that look because she had seen it every morning in the mirror through the worst years of her life. She had learned long ago how to read the silence before violence came crashing in, and in the silence between them now, she didn't read violence. She read something even harder to understand. "What's your name?" Connor asked. It wasn't a polite question. It was the question of a man who needed to know whom he owed, and just how dangerous that debt might be. "Maeve," she answered. "Maeve Donnelly." He nodded very faintly, a movement almost too small to see, then swept his gaze around them, taking in the phones being held up, the curious faces tucked behind shop windows. And he knew that standing in the middle of an intersection with a bomb under his vehicle and a strange witness beside him was the worst possible thing that could happen right now. "Put her in the second car," he told Arthur. His voice already returned to its familiar flatness, though something underneath it had changed. "Call someone to handle the thing under the car, and no one leaves here until I know what just happened." 2 hands settled on Maeve's shoulders, not roughly, but without giving her a choice, and, as she was led toward the second vehicle, she looked back at the man standing in the middle of the street and caught him still watching her, as if he were trying to remember something that had passed very close by, and somehow slipped beyond his grasp. The Fallon mansion stood at the end of a private road, lined with 2 rows of leafless trees, a stern block of gray stone architecture hidden behind a high wall and cameras that turned with every footstep. And when they led Maeve down a long corridor paved in icy marble into a room, with nothing but a dark wooden table and 2 chairs, she understood that she hadn't been brought here as a guest. They left her sitting alone for nearly an hour. She knew it was a technique, knew the waiting had been built to wear down a person's nerves, so that when the door finally opened, the person inside the room would already have softened with fear. But Maeve was far too familiar with waiting in cold rooms, waiting for her child's test results, waiting for a court decision, waiting for a drunken man's rage to cool, so familiar that fear had been worn down into something silent and more enduring. When Connor walked in, he had changed into a dark shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and he sat down across from her with the unhurried air of a man who owned all the time in the world. "In 6 years," he said, without greeting her, "no one has ever known about an assassination attempt against me in advance without being involved in it, so you have 2 choices. Tell me who sent you, or tell me why I should believe that an unemployed nurse just happened to pass by that exact car on that exact morning." Maeve didn't look away from him. "You already know I'm an unemployed nurse," she said. "That means your people looked into me while I was sitting here. If they did their work carefully, then you also know I have no connection to anyone worth your fear. I didn't know who you were until they said your name in the car. I only know I saw what I saw." Connor tilted his head slightly, and for the first time something flickered through his eyes, not trust, but the surprise of a man used to seeing people tremble before him, now facing someone who didn't tremble. "People are usually afraid of me," he said. "I know," Maeve replied, "but I've been afraid of things much worse than you. And most of them slept in the same bed with me for years. You want to scare me, go ahead, but it won't make me remember anything beyond what I'm about to tell you." In the corner of the room, Arthur Hale leaned back against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest, watching in silence, and one corner of his mouth moved faintly into something almost like a smile that Connor didn't see. Connor leaned back. "Then tell it." And Maeve told him. She told him about her night cleaning job, about the glass tower where she mopped floors from 10 o'clock at night until dawn, about cutting through the underground parking garage to get to the bus stop, because that route was better sheltered from the wind. She told him about the two men dressed like technicians, about how they didn't turn on the overhead lights, about the quiet, organized urgency in every movement they made, the kind that made her press herself behind a concrete pillar and hold her breath instead of walking on. And when she said the name of the tower, she saw something in the room change. "Vance Capitol Building," she said. "On Wacker Avenue. I clean there 3 nights a week." Connor didn't move, but Arthur had pushed away from the wall and stepped forward once, and the silence between the two men said more than any words could have. "Are you sure?" Arthur asked, his voice low and careful. "Are you certain it was that building's garage?" "I've been cleaning that floor for 8 months, Maeve replied. "I'm sure." Connor drew his hand slowly along the edge of the table, a measured gesture as if he were rearranging something inside his mind. Then he said, almost to himself, "Preston Vance." The name came out with a weight Maeve didn't fully understand, but she felt it the way a person feels a storm beginning to change direction. "For 3 months, Connor went on, this time looking straight at her, as if he had decided she already knew too much to be fed only half the truth. "Vance has been pressuring me to sell control of the South Harbor. He calls it a waterfront development project. I call it robbery wearing a suit. I refused him 3 times. He paused. "And this morning there's a bomb under my car, planted in his own parking garage." Arthur and Connor looked at each other, and in that exchanged glance, Maeve realized she had accidentally stepped into the middle of a war, far larger than she had imagined. They let her go in the early afternoon, without an explanation, without a word of thanks, with only Arthur walking her all the way to the gate and pressing an envelope into her hand, which she refused to take, shaking her head, as she said she hadn't done what she did that morning for anyone's money. Arthur looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, then put the envelope away with something almost like respect in his expression, and said quietly that someone would take her home. Maeve didn't know that from the moment the car dropped her at the edge of the run-down neighborhood where she lived, a gray sedan had quietly pulled over half a block away, and inside it, one of Connor's men recorded every door she passed through. Connor didn't trust her, but he also no longer dared take his eyes off the only person who had seen what no one was ever supposed to see. Maeve climbed 4 flights of stairs, because the elevator had been broken since the previous fall, and when she pushed open the door to the cramped apartment, the familiar smell of dampness rushed out along with a sound that made every bit of exhaustion inside her vanish in an instant. The patter-ah of small feet and a child's bright voice calling out, "Mommy's home." Greta threw herself into Maeve's arms, 5 years old, so light that Maeve always felt as if she were holding something both precious and fragile, her tangled blonde hair still carrying the scent of cheap soap, her cheeks a little pale in a way only a mother could understand. Mrs. Lorna, the neighbor who watched Greta for her in exchange for a few meals and simple kindness, rose from the old sofa and said the little girl had been good all day, though she had grown a little tired in the afternoon and had lain down for a while. Maeve thanked her, and when the door closed, she carried her daughter to sit beside the window, where the last sunlight of the day fell in a thin golden stripe across the peeling wooden floor. "What did you draw for me today?" she asked, and Greta pulled a wrinkled sheet of paper from under her pillow. On it was a house with a chimney, 3 stick figures, and an enormous sun colored in a bright orange. "This is you, this is me, and this is the cat we're going to have someday." Maeve held her a little tighter, folded the drawing, and tucked it into the pocket of her coat, where it would stay with her through every road she had to walk, because it was the only thing that reminded her why she still had to keep going. That night, after Greta had fallen asleep, Maeve sat at the kitchen table, with a stack of bills piled into a small mountain she didn't dare look at for too long. Her little girl's heart had been born beating out of rhythm, a defect the doctors described with long Latin words, and they had said that if surgery wasn't done before she grew much older, that broken rhythm would slowly become something that could no longer be repaired. The operation cost $40,000. Maeve's insurance had disappeared along with her nursing license. She had called every charity fund, every hospital, every organization in the directory, and most of them had told her the same sentence in different voices, that the waiting list was very long, that resources were limited, that she should try somewhere else. But there was one thing she couldn't forget, one thing she had been turning over and over in her mind for weeks. 3 months earlier, When she had taken Greta to the hospital for a round of screenings tests she knew she couldn't possibly afford, she had stood at the payment counter, her heart pounding, preparing herself to beg for an installment plan, when the employee looked up at the screen and said in confusion that the entire cost had already been paid. An anonymous benefactor. No message, no name, no conditions. Maeve had asked again and again, had thought there must be some mistake, but they had only shaken their heads and smiled, saying that sometimes there were still acts of kindness in the world that people didn't need to know the source of. She had cried in the parking lot that day, not out of relief, but because for the first time in a very long while, someone had seen her when she had grown used to being invisible. She never knew who that person was, and she couldn't have imagined that the man whose life she had just saved that morning, the man with dead eyes, was that very quiet shadow. Arthur Hale worked through the night in the small room behind the mansion library, where he kept files that no networked computer was ever allowed to touch. And by the time the pale sun of the following morning began slipping through the gaps in the curtains, he had reconstructed almost the entire life of the woman named Maeve Donnelly, piece by piece, clean enough that it was precisely that cleanliness that made him believe her. No ties to any organization. No strange money flowing into her accounts. Nothing but a long chain of misfortunes piled onto a person who had once had a decent life. But there was one line in the file that made Arthur stop for a very long time, reading it again and again, before he set the papers down on the desk and sat still in the darkness for a while before going to find Connor. He found Connor in his study, standing beside the window with a cup of black coffee gone cold in his hand, looking out at the gray garden as if he were staring through it toward someplace much farther away. "I looked into her," Arthur said, placing the file on the desk. "Clean. She's not Vance's person, not anyone's person. She's exactly what she said she was." Connor didn't turn around. "Good. Then have our people stop watching her and leave her alone." "There's one more thing," Arthur said, and something in his voice finally made Connor turn his head. "She used to be a nurse at St. Bridget Hospital, pediatric intensive care. Until 6 years ago, the room seemed to freeze solid." Connor set the coffee cup down very slowly, as if one sudden movement might break something. St. Bridget. That name was one he never spoke aloud, never allowed anyone to mention in front of him, because that was where he had sat for 3 days beside the bed of a child he couldn't save, where he had been a father for the last time in his life, where he had walked out with a heart that had stopped beating in the only sense that still mattered. "Connor," Arthur said softly, "Sean's final night. The night you wouldn't let anyone into the room, the night you sat there alone. There was a nurse who stayed past the end of her shift. She was the only one who didn't look at you with fear, didn't ask who you were, didn't call security. She brought you coffee, pulled a chair closer to the bed so you could sit without hurting so much, and when it was over, she was the one who laid the blanket over the boy and told you that you had done everything a father could do." Connor said nothing. For 6 years, he had forgotten many things on purpose, had built walls to bury that night so deep that he could no longer remember the face of the young nurse who had stayed beside him, only a gentle voice and a hand that didn't tremble while his entire world was collapsing. "It was her," he said, not as a question. "It was her," Arthur confirmed, and then like the final piece of a puzzle falling into its rightful place, Connor understood something even he had forgotten he had once done. 3 months earlier, on an evening when he couldn't sleep at all, he had done what he still quietly did on nights like that, sitting down to look through the list of children who needed heart surgery at St. Bridget, the place he had been secretly funding for 6 years without ever letting his name appear anywhere, because it was the only way he still knew how to keep the memory of his son from becoming entirely meaningless. On that list was the name of a 5-year-old girl with a congenital heart defect, and he had paid for the child's entire round of screening tests, the way he had done for dozens of other children, never asking the names of their parents, never wanting to know. The little girl's name was Greta Donnelly. "My God," Connor whispered, and for the first time in a very long while, his voice was no longer flat. The woman who had saved his life yesterday morning was the same woman who had stayed beside his son in his final hour, and the daughter she was struggling to save was one of the children he had quietly helped in order to atone for something that could never truly be atoned for. Their 2 lives had been woven together long before she stepped into the middle of the road, and neither of them had ever known it. There was one question Connor couldn't push out of his mind from the moment they found the device beneath the vehicle. A question colder and sharper than the bomb itself, and it was how Vance had known which route he would take, at what hour, in which car, within a schedule Connor deliberately kept sealed and changed constantly so no one could predict it. Only a handful of people knew the route that morning, and one of them had sold him out. Connor told no one but Arthur. He didn't allow his anger to show, didn't change his manner toward any of the people closest to him, because he understood that the only way to find a snake inside the house was to make it believe it still hadn't been discovered. He had the communication system reworked, quietly created 3 slightly different versions of his schedule, and let each version reach a different group of people. Then he sat back and waited to see which version would leak. It took nearly a week, and when the answer surfaced, it left both Connor and Arthur silent, because the name was one neither of them wanted to believe. Desmond Kane, 44 years old, a man who had stood within the Fallon ranks for nearly 20 years, a man who had once taken a bullet meant for Connor's father during the Old Harbor War, a man Connor still called brother whenever they raised a glass. Arthur was the one who placed the photographs on the desk, distant images showing Desmond entering an empty cafe in the suburbs before dawn, sitting across from a man in a long coat whom the surveillance team had identified as one of Vance Capital's security advisors. "I don't want to believe this any more than you do," Arthur said quietly, "but the schedule version Desmond received is the exact one that reached Vance. There's no doubt left." Connor looked at the photographs for a very long time, and what twisted inside him wasn't the betrayal, because in his world betrayal was something he had learned to anticipate, but the fact that he couldn't understand why a man like Desmond, a man who had proven his loyalty in blood, would do this. He didn't give the order to deal with him at once. Instead, he told Arthur to dig deeper, more quietly, to find out what had driven a loyal man to sell both his honor and his brother's. And what Arthur uncovered over the next 3 days changed completely the way Connor saw the matter. Desmond's daughter, a 16-year-old girl named Hannah, had disappeared from the boarding school she had attended for 2 weeks, and although Desmond had told everyone that the girl was visiting relatives in another state, the records showed something else. Hannah had been seen being put into a vehicle with a plate connected to a subsidiary of the Vance Corporation. Vance hadn't bought Desmond with money. He didn't need to. He only needed to hold the most precious thing a father had, and whisper into the man's ear that his child's safety depended on how obedient he was willing to be. Connor sat in the dark for a very long time after hearing this, and Arthur, who understood him better than anyone still alive, knew that the anger inside Connor was no longer aimed at Desmond, but had turned in another direction, colder, deeper, and far more dangerous. "He used a child," Connor said, his voice so low that Arthur had to lean closer to hear him. "He aimed at a man's child to force that man to betray. That's the kind of man we're facing." He rose, walked to the window, and in that moment something inside him seemed to harden and soften at the same time, because he understood the fear of a father whose child had been taken hostage better than anyone else in the world. "Don't touch Desmond," he said. "Let him believe he's still safe. Find the girl. Before we do anything else, we find his daughter." Arthur nodded, and for the first time in many years, he saw in the man he served a faint light he had believed had gone out completely after that night at St. Bridget. The person Arthur sought out to analyze the device was a former military explosives disposal specialist, a quiet man named Wendell who had worked with bomb disposal units overseas before leaving the service and disappearing from every list, a man the Fallon family still kept in contact with for matters that required eyes that never saw wrong. Wendell took 2 days to dissect every detail of the device they had removed from beneath the vehicle. And when he called Arthur to the old workshop at the edge of the city to give his report, his face carried the troubled look of a man who had seen far too much and still found this one thing difficult to understand. "I thought this was an assassination bomb," Wendell said, resting his hand on the pieces of components arranged neatly across the table. "But it isn't. Or more precisely, it isn't only that." Arthur pulled out a chair and sat down, while Connor, who had insisted on coming along, even though Arthur had advised him to stay home, leaned against the doorframe and listened in silence. "A bomb meant to kill someone," Wendell continued, "would be triggered as soon as the target was inside the vehicle, or when the engine started, or by remote control at the exact moment. Fast, clean, certain. But this thing was programmed with a positioning unit. It doesn't detonate by time, and it doesn't detonate by command. It was set to explode when the vehicle entered a specific coordinate. He turned the computer screen around for both men to see. A map. A blinking red point. This coordinate, Wendell said, is the central warehouse district of the South Harbor. For one moment, the entire workshop sank into the kind of thick silence Connor had begun to know too well. The kind of silence that always appeared just before a larger truth revealed itself. And there's something else, Wendell added, pointing to a small part separated from the rest. The main explosive charge was insulated from the passenger cabin. Its structure was calculated to drive the entire force of the blast outward and forward into the warehouse area, not inward into the vehicle. Whoever was sitting inside the vehicle would almost certainly survive, injured, stunned, but alive. Whoever made this didn't want to kill the person in the car. He wanted that person to live. Connor pushed away from the doorframe and stepped closer to the table, his eyes fixed on the red point on the map, and every piece began fitting together in his mind with the cold precision of a machine coming to life. He didn't want me dead, Connor said slowly, as if reading a sentence aloud. He wanted me to survive. He wanted my vehicle to explode right in the middle of my harbor, carrying what everyone would believe was explosive material stored and transported by the Fallon family. Arthur let out a long breath, and in that breath there was both horror and reluctant admiration at the cruelty and sophistication of the plan. An explosion at the harbor, he continued Connor's thought, in broad daylight, with the owner of the harbor surviving right there at the scene. The press would call it terrorism. Federal authorities would move in within a few hours. They would seal off the entire harbor as a crime scene, freeze every operation, and with a survivor standing right there beside the evidence of a vehicle loaded with explosives, they would have enough reason to seize the whole property while investigating. Connor nodded, and the corner of his mouth curved into something that wasn't a smile, but the expression of a man who had just seen the bottom of a well. He had thought he had reached long ago, and once the harbor was sealed, seized, and labeled a public danger, he said, there would be a respectable investor ready to step into the light with a polished redevelopment project, promising jobs, promising safety, promising to clean up the dangerous mess the Fallon family left behind. The city would thank him. They would hand him the harbor like a gift. He lifted his eyes to Arthur, and this time there wasn't a trace of doubt left in his voice. This wasn't an assassination, Arthur. This was a robbery staged so the whole city would applaud. And Preston Vance almost succeeded, if not for a cleaning woman who happened to look beneath a car. In that moment, Connor understood that the debt he owed Maeve Donnelly was much greater than one more morning of life. Connor came to find her late one afternoon, without warning, without display. Only a black car pulling up in front of the old building before he climbed the 4 flights of stairs alone, leaving his men down on the street, because he understood that if he wanted this woman to listen to him, he couldn't arrive as a crime boss. He had to arrive as a human being. Maeve opened the door with a fruit knife still in her hand, not because she meant to use it, but because instinct had taught her never to open the door to a strange man with both hands empty, and when she realized who he was, she didn't invite him in. She only stood blocking the doorway, with the sound of the television drifting from the living room behind her, where Greta was watching cartoons. You shouldn't be here, she said quietly, her eyes flicking back over her shoulder. My little girl doesn't need to see someone like you. Connor wasn't offended. He nodded and stepped back slightly so she could see he had no intention of forcing his way in. I know, he said, and I won't stay long. I came to tell you something you need to know. The bomb that morning wasn't aimed at me to kill me. It was part of something bigger, and you accidentally broke it apart. The person behind this isn't the kind of man who'll overlook that. He'll want to know who ruined his plan, and if he traces it back to you, he won't be merciful. Maeve tightened her grip on the knife handle, not because of him, but because fear had just slipped into her chest like a current of cold air. I'm just a cleaning woman, she said. I'm nothing to people like that. That's exactly what makes you dangerous to him, Connor replied. You're someone no one notices, and you saw what no one was supposed to see. To men Lyot's fence, aimless witness is more frightening than an enemy with a name. He paused, and his voice softened in a way even he hadn't expected. I want to send people to protect you and your daughter. Quietly, no one will know, not even the little girl. Just a few people nearby to make sure nothing happens. Maeve looked at him for a long time, and inside her, two irreconcilable things were tearing at each other. One part of her, the part that had once been a nurse, once believed in good things, cried out that she couldn't allow her child anywhere near a man the whole city called a killer, that accepting protection from a crime boss meant setting one foot into the very world she had spent her whole life trying to avoid. But the other part, the part too exhausted from carrying everything alone, the part used to no one ever reaching out a hand to help her, recognized something that unsettled her, that the man standing in front of her wasn't looking at her with the eyes of someone granting charity, didn't carry the condescension of people who came to help, only so they could collect something later, but looked at her as if he himself were carrying some debt she didn't understand. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do this for someone you don't even know? Don't tell me it's out of kindness. Men like you don't survive this long because of kindness." The question struck somewhere inside Connor, and for one moment she saw the ice in his eyes crack, revealing something old and painful beneath it before he quickly covered it again. "You're right," he admitted. "I don't survive because of kindness, but I owe you more than you think, and I'm not the kind of man who likes carrying debts. Consider me doing this for myself, if that makes it easier for you to accept." Maeve didn't fully understand what he meant, but she could feel the honesty in it, and that was what she had least expected from a man like him. She looked back into the apartment, where Greta Glaw's blonde hair rose just above the back of the sofa, small and fragile, and she understood that she no longer had the right to proudly refuse, not when the thing being threatened was the only thing that still gave her life meaning. "Your people aren't allowed to come near my little girl," she said at last, her voice growing hoarse. "And if I feel anything is wrong, I'll take my child and leave, and you'll never find us again." Connor nodded, and before he turned away, he added one very quiet sentence. "That little girl is lucky to have you as her mother." Then he walked back down the stairs, leaving Maeve standing there with the knife in her hand, and the strange feeling that her world had just tilted in a direction she couldn't possibly predict. Meeting Greta hadn't been part of anyone's plan. And perhaps that was exactly why it happened. 1 week after that afternoon, when Maeve received word from the hospital that an appointment with a heart specialist had suddenly opened up. An appointment she would normally have had to wait months for. She didn't know that Connor had quietly arranged it, and because she had no one to leave her daughter with, she had no choice but to bring Greta along in the car he had sent to pick them both up. Connor hadn't intended to be there. He just happened to be inside the car when it stopped for them, on his way to another meeting, and when the door opened, he found himself facing a pair of wide blue-gray eyes looking at him with fearless curiosity. Maeve went rigid and quickly pulled her daughter closer, but Greta had already slipped free of her mother's hand and climbed onto the seat, sitting down across from the strange man, with the easy calm only children possess, the easy calm of a soul that hasn't yet learned there are people in this world one is supposed to fear. The little girl tilted her head and studied him for a long while, as intently as if she were solving a puzzle, then suddenly announced in her clear little voice, "You are the sad bear." The whole car went still. Maeve opened her mouth to apologize, but Connor lifted his hand very slightly to stop her, then turned to look at the child with an expression Arthur, sitting in the front seat, hadn't seen in 6 years. "Why do you say I'm sad?" he asked, and his voice no longer held any trace of the crime boss, none of its familiar ice, only the honest curiosity of a man who had just been seen through by a child. Greta shrugged in that very grown-up way children sometimes have. "Because your eyes are like my teddy bear's," she said. "My bear has one broken eye and lost the little sound inside him, so he always looks sad, even when I smile at him. Your eyes are like that too. Sad even when you aren't crying." Inside the warm cabin of the car, something broke very softly inside Connor's chest, something he had sealed away with great care for 6 years, ever since that night at St. Brigid, when he had learned how to stop feeling anything so he could keep living. This child, with her heart beating out of rhythm, and her eyes seeing straight through every wall he had built, had given a name to the very thing his cleverest enemies and closest allies had never dared to name. And he realized that if his son were still alive, he would be just a little older than this, would climb onto a car seat with that same innocent ease, would say things so plainly they made the heart ache. Connor bent down to the little girl's eye level a gesture he had once made with another child a very long time ago, and asked, "Then do you know any way to make the bear stop being sad?" Greta thought about it very seriously, pressing her lips together, then nodded firmly. "Yes. Mommy says sad bears are sad because they think nobody needs them anymore. So I hug mine every night so he knows he's still needed. Then little by little, he'll feel less sad." She reached out, and before Maeve could react, that tiny hand had settled on the back of the most powerful man in the city's hand, a hand that had issued orders that made people tremble, now covered by small fingers still stained with crayon. "Don't be sad anymore," Greta said, and Connor Fallon, the man who hadn't cried at the funeral of his own wife and child because he had no tears left to cry, the man who had ruled through fear for 6 years and forgotten what it felt like to have someone be gentle with him, smiled. Not the cold smirk he used to frighten others, not the mocking curve of his mouth when he had someone cornered, but a real smile, fragile and bewildered, like the smile of a man who had just remembered a language he had forgotten long ago. Maeve saw that smile, and in that moment, her prejudice against this man cracked along a line that could never be sealed again, because she understood that someone truly dead inside couldn't smile like that in front of a child. Arthur, in the front seat, turned his face toward the window and pretended to watch the streets, hiding the emotion rising in his aging eyes. The woman who called Maeve on a rainy evening introduced herself as Detective Renata Soto, 38 years old, from the police department's financial crimes unit, and asked to meet her privately at a small cafe, far from the neighborhood where Maeve lived, a place with no cameras, and where no one knew either of their faces. Maeve almost refused, because she had learned that people who carried badges rarely brought anything good to people like her. But there was something in Renata's tired yet steady voice that made her agree, and she came, sitting down across from a woman with the dark circles of someone who had chased one thing for so long that it had soaked into her skin. "I know you lost your nursing license," Renata said, without circling around it. "I know they said you misplaced a shipment of pain medication and blamed you for it, and I came here to tell you that I don't believe that story. I never have." Maeve tightened her hands around the cup of hot tea, and an emotion she had buried long ago, the rage of being falsely accused when no one would listen, rose thickly in her throat. "It's been 2 years," she said softly. "For 2 years I told everyone I didn't do it. No one believed me. So why does someone believe me now?" Renata placed a thin file on the table, and when she opened it, Maeve saw a name that made her heart clench. Dr. Wallace Thorne. "He was the one who signed the report that cost you your license, wasn't he?" Renata asked, though she already knew the answer. Maeve nodded, her throat dry. Wallace Thorne, the senior doctor she had once respected, the man who had stood before the disciplinary board with a face full of false regret and presented numbers she couldn't disprove. The man who had destroyed her career and her entire life with a single signature. "I've been investigating Thorne for almost a year," Renata said, lowering her voice, though the cafe was nearly empty. "Not because of you. I'm sorry, in the beginning I didn't even know about you. I was investigating him because of something else, a stream of money that didn't match, flowing through hospitals across the city. And the deeper I dug, the more I saw it leading back to the same place." She turned to the next page, where a diagram of lines connected names to one another like a spider web, and at the center of that web was a name Maeve now knew far too well. Vance Capital. "Preston Vance isn't just swallowing up real estate," Renata said. "He controls an entire medical board behind 3 private hospitals in this city, and those hospitals are being used to clean his dirty money. Fake invoices, patients who don't exist, treatment rounds inflated to hundreds of thousands of dollars. Dirty money goes in, legal medical bills come out. Thorne is one of the people approving those invoices." Maeve sat in silence, and old fragments of memory began returning beneath an entirely different light. "The shipment," she whispered. "The shipment they said I lost." "You saw something," Renata said. "Maybe you didn't even realize what you saw. A ledger that didn't match, an unusual per prescription, a wrong number. You worked in intensive care, you had access to records, to medication storage. A careful, honest nurse asking exactly the wrong question, at exactly the wrong time, was all it took for Thorne to decide you had to disappear from that hospital before you accidentally brought down the whole chain. They didn't need you to commit a crime. They only needed a story convincing enough that no one would bother listening to you anymore." Maeve felt the world around her begin to move more slowly, because what Renata had just said didn't only return the innocence she had lost. It showed her a larger and more frightening truth, that the hand that had pushed her to the bottom 2 years ago, and the hand now threatening her daughter were the same hand, reaching from different directions, touching real estate, touching the harbor, and touching even the place that should have been most sacred, the place people came to be healed. "I came to find you," Renata said, looking straight into Maeve's eyes, "because you're the only living person I know who has been inside it and paid the price. I need someone willing to stand up and testify. But I won't blame you if you say no, because people who dare stand against Vance usually don't come to a good end." Maeve brought what Renata had told her to Connor the very next night, and this time she came to the mansion not as someone being escorted under guard, but as someone carrying a weapon, and they sat together in the library until late into the night, spreading Renata's file beside Arthur's documents, following every trail of money, every name, linking the harbor to the hospitals, linking the bomb to the fake invoices, rebuilding the full shape of the monster they were both facing. As Maeve pointed to a line of figures and explained with her medical knowledge that a course of treatment like this couldn't possibly cost that much, that it had to be a fabricated invoice, Connor watched her work with the focus of someone who had once been capable and proud of that capability, and he said softly, almost without meaning to, "You should still be a nurse." Maeve didn't look up. "I used to think that if I worked hard enough, kindly enough, honestly enough, the system would protect me," she said. "It turns out the system only protects the people rich enough to buy it. I lost everything just because I asked one question, and the man who pushed me down is still sitting in boardrooms, signing people killing signatures that no one dares touch." Connor set down his pen. "That's how power works," he said. "I understand it better than anyone, because I've lived by it for 6 years. Power is the ability to make other people stay silent, to make the truth disappear, to turn a decent person invisible with nothing but a few signatures and a few phone calls. Vance has more power than I do. He has clean money, lawyers, boards, and an entire city that thinks he's a good man." Maeve finally lifted her eyes to him. "Then what do we have?" Connor was silent for a moment, and when he answered, even he was surprised by his own reply. "We have the one thing he can't understand," he said. "He thinks everyone has a price. Everyone is afraid. Everyone will kneel if you threaten the right place. He can't imagine a cleaning woman stepping into the middle of the road to stop a bomb when she has nothing to gain from it. He doesn't understand that, so he isn't prepared for it. You're the variable none of his calculations saw coming." There was a strange warmth in the silence inside that room full of papers, and Maeve realized that for the first time in a very long while, someone was telling her that her kindness wasn't a weakness, but a strength. "What did you used to have?" she asked quietly, not looking at him, her eyes still fixed on the file. "Before you became this, before your eyes became sad like Greta's bear." Connor didn't answer right away, and when he finally spoke, his voice lowered into something she had never heard before. "I used to have a family," he said. "A wife who laughed at my terrible jokes. A little boy who was afraid of the dark and made me check under the bed every night. Then one morning, someone put something under a car, just like the morning you saw it, and that time there was no one who stepped into the road to warn us. I survived. They didn't. And I spent 6 years turning myself into something frightening enough that no one would ever dare come near me again, because I thought that if no one came near, I'd never have to lose anything else." Maeve lifted her head, and this time their eyes met, 2 people carrying different wounds with the same shape, both crushed and cast aside by something larger than themselves, both having learned to become invisible in their own ways, he through fear, she through silence. "Hiding doesn't save anyone," she said gently. "I've been hiding my whole life, and it only made me lose more. My little girl taught me that. Every morning she wakes up with a heart that could stop at any moment, and still she draws the sun orange and asks for a cat. She doesn't hide, she lives." In that moment neither of them touched, neither of them said another word, but something shifted between them, quietly and irreversibly, like 2 broken pieces suddenly recognizing that they fit together. For 3 days everything seemed to be tilting in their favor. Arthur had found the place where Hannah, Desmond's daughter, was being held, a secluded vacation house registered under a Vance subsidiary, and they had quietly gotten the girl out safely on a moonless night, returning her to an aunt in another state whom Vance knew nothing about. Once the weight hanging over his head had been lifted, Desmond collapsed to his knees in front of Connor, not begging for his life, only sobbing out apology after apology. And Connor, who in another version of himself would have dealt with him mercilessly, placed a hand on the shoulder of the man who had betrayed him and said that he understood, that any father would have done the same, that Desmond could make it right by telling them everything. And Desmond told them. Arthur recorded the entire confession, every detail of how Vance approached him, every meeting, every order, a recording that could become the decisive piece in building the case against him. They thought they had gained the advantage. They were wrong. Vance hadn't become the most powerful man in the city by losing track of his prey, and he had smelled danger before they had even managed to strike. On the morning of the fourth day, Arthur walked into the safe where the recording and its copies were kept and found it empty. It hadn't been forced open. There was no sign of a crude break-in. It had been opened cleanly with the exact code known only to a handful of people, and that cleanliness spoke of something that chilled both Connor and Arthur, that Vance still had an eye somewhere inside their inner circle, or worse, that he had the ability to reach places they had believed were untouchable. The original recording was gone. Every copy was gone. Desmond's confession, the sharpest weapon they had evaporated as if it had never existed. But that was only the beginning of that day. That afternoon, when Maeve tried to call Renata to report what had happened and discuss the next step, all she got were long rings that fell into voicemail, again and again, and a familiar unease began creeping through her chest, the kind of feeling she had learned from years of reading silence before disaster struck. Renata always answered. A detective investigating a dangerous network like that would never leave her phone out of reach. Maeve called Connor, and within 1 hour, his people had tracked down the thing no one wanted to hear. Renata's car had been found abandoned in an underground parking garage, the doors unlocked, her purse still on the seat, her phone lying beneath the seat with the screen shattered. There were no signs of a long struggle, no witnesses, nothing except the sudden and total absence of a woman who had been sitting across from Maeve just yesterday, saying that people who dared stand against Vance usually didn't come to a good end. Renata Soto had disappeared. Connor stood in the middle of the library, looking at the files that had now lost the core of their legal value, and for the first time since that morning at the intersection, he felt the thing he hated most in the world, the feeling of being on the back foot, the feeling that his opponent was one move ahead of him. He took away our only police witness, Arthur said, his voice heavy, and he took the confession. Now if we bring anything into the light, it's just the word of a crime boss and a nurse who lost her license against a philanthropist the whole city respects. He's turned the board upside down. Maeve looked at Connor, and she saw something she had never expected to see in him, a flash of real confusion, the first crack in the armor of confidence he always wore. He did this as a warning, Connor said slowly, as if speaking to himself. He's showing us he can reach anyone, a police detective, a recording inside my own safe. He's saying no one is safe. He turned to Maeve, and in his eyes there passed a fear he hadn't allowed himself to feel in 6 years. Not fear for himself, but fear for someone else. He's saying, Connor whispered, that next time he'll touch the thing that hurts us most. The question burning in Connor's mind all that night was how Vance had opened the safe, because only 3 people in the world knew its code. Connor himself, Desmond and Arthur. And Desmond had been under 24/7 surveillance from the moment he confessed, so he couldn't have been the one. When Connor had his people review the security system, the result that came back made the whole room seem to collapse beneath his feet. The access log showed that the safe had been opened at 3 o'clock in the morning, using Arthur Hale's own code, and the hallway camera, though blocked during the crucial moment, had still captured a figure with the gait and coat everyone recognized as Arthur's, quietly walking toward the safe room. Then they found a prepaid phone in Arthur's desk drawer, one he had never reported, and inside it were several brief messages exchanged with a number traced to a shell company belonging to Vance. Every piece of evidence pointed in one direction. The old advisor, the man who had stood beside the Fallon family for 30 years, was the snake inside the house. Connor stood in the library with those papers spread before him, and a cold unlike anything he had ever known rose inside him, colder even than the cold from 6 years before. Because if even Arthur had betrayed him, then there was nothing left in this world that was real. He summoned Arthur in the middle of the night. When the old advisor walked in, Connor was already standing there, and in his hand, for the first time Maeve had ever seen, he held a gun. Not raised, only hanging at his side, but its presence was enough to make the air in the room turn solid. "My safe code," Connor said, his voice stripped of every trace of warmth, cold and sharp as a blade. 3 o'clock in the morning. Prepaid phone. "Explain it, Arthur. Explain to me how 30 years ends like this." Arthur looked at the evidence on the table, and what made Maeve, standing tucked into the corner of the room, realize something was wrong was his reaction. He didn't panic. He didn't beg. He looked at the prepaid phone for a long time, then lifted his eyes to Connor with an old man's deep sorrow instead of fear, and he said very quietly, "You truly believe it was me?" That question, not a denial but a question, made Connor's hand go still. "I held you when you couldn't even walk yet," Arthur continued, his voice trembling, but his body not retreating. "I stood beside your father when he fell. I was with you for all 3 days at St. Brigid when you wouldn't let anyone else come near. If I had wanted you dead, you had died 1,000 times by now, in the moments when you slept, in the moments when you trusted me most. I didn't need a bomb. I didn't need Vance." And then Maeve, who had spent her whole life reading truth in the faces people tried to hide, stepped out of the corner. "Connor, stop," she said. "Think about it. Everything is too perfect. A man who managed to hide a betrayal for 30 years would leave an access log under his own code. He would leave a prepaid phone right in his desk drawer. He would wear the exact coat everyone recognizes to open a safe in front of a camera. A careful traitor who lasted 30 years would never be that careless. These aren't the traces of a guilty man. These are traces someone deliberately laid out for you to find." The room went silent, and Connor, through the red haze of his anger, began to see what she saw. Vance hadn't only wanted to take the recording. He wanted more than that. He knew Connor's greatest weapon wasn't money, wasn't guns, but Arthur, the mind behind every move, the only person Connor trusted completely. And if he could make Connor remove Arthur with his own hands, then he would cut off his enemy's right arm without spending a single bullet. He had planted the false evidence not to accuse Arthur, but to borrow Connor's hand to kill the man most loyal to him. Connor looked down at the gun in his hand, then lifted his eyes to the face of the man who had raised him, and something inside him broke. He set the gun down on the table, stepped forward, and embraced Arthur, holding him tightly like a child clinging to the father he had almost lost, and for the first time in 6 years, there were tears in Connor Fallon's eyes. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice choking. "God, I almost—" Arthur patted his back, his old eyes blurring. "I know," he said. "I know, and that's exactly what he wanted. He wanted you so alone that there would be no one left for you to trust. Don't give him that, son." Never the call came close to midnight, and Maeve knew from the very first ring that it was the thing she had feared every day since her daughter was born. Mrs. Lorna was on the other end, her voice so panicked it could barely form words, saying Greta had suddenly started gasping for breath, that her lips had gone pale, that she had called an ambulance, that they were taking the little girl away. Maeve didn't remember how she ran down 4 flights of stairs, didn't remember how she called Connor, only remembered her own voice breaking apart as she managed to ask 3 words into the phone. "How is she?" And then she was sitting in Connor's car as it tore through the night streets, both hands clutching the drawing of the orange sun in her coat pocket so tightly that her knuckles turned white. But when they arrived, another fear layered itself over the fear that had already become unbearable. The ambulance hadn't taken Greta to the public hospital near home the way it should have. It had taken her to Meridian Medical Center, a gleaming private hospital downtown, one of the 3 hospitals Renata had identified as being under the control of the board Vance manipulated from behind the scenes. Maeve understood instantly what that meant, and the blood in her body seemed to freeze. When she rushed into the emergency lobby, screaming her daughter's name, a nurse stopped her with a face trained to appear calm, saying the little girl was being cared for, that the doctor in charge of the case was a leading specialist. And when that doctor stepped out from behind the doors, Maeve felt the ground collapse beneath her feet. It was Wallace Thorne. The man who had destroyed her life 2 years earlier now stood there in a spotless white coat, smiling at her with the same false regretful smile he had used before the disciplinary board. And he said in a velvet voice that it was such an unfortunate coincidence, that he would personally look after the little girl, that Maeve didn't need to worry about a thing. Every word he spoke was a threat wrapped in sugar. Connor's phone rang at that exact moment, an unknown number. He stepped into the empty hallway to answer, and the voice on the other end was the voice he had been waiting for, and hating for weeks, smooth, relaxed, full of the smugness of a man who believed he had already won. "Connor," Preston Vance said, as if they were two old friends, "I hear a little girl has just been admitted to the hospital. Poor little heart. I've always said a child's health is the most fragile thing in the world. One wrong medical decision, one medication given at the wrong dose, and everything can change in an instant. Dr. Thorne is my man. You understand what I'm saying." Connor stood motionless in the hallway, and in that moment, he understood exactly the trap closing around him. Vance was giving him a choice presented as a choice. But in truth it was a noose. Back down. Hand over the harbor. Burn every piece of evidence. Let Vance win. And the little girl would receive proper treatment. Or keep fighting. And a wrong medical decision would happen to the child he had no legal right to protect. Inside a hospital he didn't control. Under the hands of a doctor who belonged to his enemy. It was the moment Connor's entire life of power had prepared him for. Vance thought he would calculate like a crime boss, weighing his empire against the life of a child who wasn't his blood. But when Connor turned his head and looked through the glass panel into the emergency room, where Maeve was kneeling beside her daughter's bed, holding that tiny hand and whispering, "Mommy's here, Mommy's not going anywhere," he didn't see a chess piece. He saw blonde hair and a pair of eyes that had once seen through him and called him the sad bear. He saw something he had once lost and had sworn he would never let himself lose again. And in that instant, the man who had ruled through fear for 6 years made his choice, not with the cold mind that had kept him alive, but with the part of himself he had believed had died at St. Brigid. "Listen to me, Vance," he said into the phone, his voice terrifyingly calm. "I'm only going to say this once. If one hair on that little girl's head is harmed, there will be no harbor, no agreement, no place on this earth far enough for you to hide from me. You wanted me alone. You just made the mistake of giving me something to protect." He ended the call and turned to Arthur, who was standing beside him. "Call Dr. Bennett. Call the team. We're getting that little girl out of here tonight." Moving a pediatric patient in critical condition out of a hospital that didn't want to let her go wasn't something that could be done by force, and Connor understood that better than anyone, because one violent act in the hospital lobby would give Vance the excuse he needed to call the police, to turn Connor into a kidnapper, to close every door. This had to be done with a clear head, and it had to be done fast, while Arthur contacted Dr. Bennett. The leading pediatric heart surgeon whom the Fallon family had quietly funded for years, and who was beyond Vance's reach, Connor needed someone who could enter Meridian's system without raising suspicion, someone who understood how Vance operated from the inside. That person was Desmond. When Connor called, Desmond arrived within 20 minutes, and when he heard Connor's brief explanation of what was happening, the face of the man who had once betrayed him changed in a way Maeve would never forget. "A child," Desmond said, his voice thick and hoarse. "He's using a child again. He did it to my daughter, and now he's doing it to this little girl." He looked at Connor, and in his eyes there was no longer the fear of a man being blackmailed, only the cold resolve of a father who had once stood in this exact place. "I betrayed you to save my child. Now let me make it right by saving hers." The plan was built in 10 minutes. Desmond, still believed by Vance's side to be working for them, entered Meridian through the staff entrance. Carrying transfer papers Arthur had prepared legally down to the last word, bearing Dr. Bennett's signature and every required procedure, documents even Thorne would have trouble rejecting in public without exposing himself. Meanwhile, Maeve stayed beside her daughter's bed, and her task, the hardest task of all, was to keep Thorne busy and unsuspecting, to play the role of a mother who had surrendered. She did it with everything she had left in her, sitting there with red-rimmed eyes as she looked at Thorne and said in a trembling voice that she only wanted what was best for her child, that she would do anything, and Thorne, who had always underestimated this woman, believed her, because he could never imagine that the desperate mother in front of him was performing a role to buy time. When Desmond appeared in the ward with the transfer documents and their own medical team, Thorne froze, his eyes sharpening with caution, and he said that moving a patient in this condition was far too dangerous, that he couldn't allow it. In that tense moment, as Thorne reached for the phone to call security, Desmond stepped forward and blocked him, not touching him at all. only standing there with the full weight of a man who had decided not to retreat, and said softly enough for only Thorne to hear that he should think very carefully, that a copy of many things he had signed was sitting somewhere safe, and that if anything happened to the little girl tonight, he would be the first person Vance sacrificed when everything came crashing down. It wasn't a threat made with fists. It was the truth spoken at exactly the right time, and it made Thorne's hand go still on the telephone receiver. For several endless seconds, the corrupt doctor stood between two commands. On one side Vance, and the power that had bought his soul. On the other something else, something more fragile. Something Maeve saw flicker very faintly in his eyes when he glanced toward the child on the bed. Something perhaps even Thorne had believed he had lost long ago. Taking advantage of that hesitation, Dr. Bennett's team quickly transferred Greta onto the stretcher and wheeled her out of the room, and Maeve walked beside her, one hand gripping her daughter's hand tightly, the other still holding the drawing in her coat pocket as if it were a charm. When the elevator doors closed, separating them from Wallace Thorne's bloodless face, Desmond was the last one to step inside, and before the doors shut completely, he looked at the doctor and said one final sentence. "It still isn't too late for you to choose the right side, doctor. I know because I once stood exactly where you're standing now." They took Greta to an independent children's hospital in the suburbs where Dr. Bennett had full authority. And there, beneath the lights of the recovery room, and under the care of people who belonged to no one except the oath of their profession, the little girl was stabilized again, her unsteady heartbeat drawn back into rhythm, and Maeve was allowed to sit beside the bed, holding her daughter's hand, watching that tiny chest rise and fall evenly once more, while her tears fell silently onto the white blanket. But something none of them had expected happened at dawn the next morning, when a taxi stopped in front of the hospital gates, and a man stepped out with the appearance of someone who hadn't slept for many hours, his white coat replaced by an ordinary jacket, his face marked by something that had broken apart and been rebuilt into a different shape. Wallace Thorne. Connor's men immediately rose in warning, but Thorne lifted both hands to show he had come alone, with no weapon, no scheme, and he asked to see Maeve. She stepped into the hallway to face the man who had destroyed her life, and for one moment, all the anger she had buried for 2 years surged up inside her, but she said nothing. She only looked at him and waited. "How is the little girl?" Thorne asked, and his voice no longer carried that false velvet softness, only the bare exhaustion of a human being. "She'll live," Maeve answered coldly. "Not because of you." "No," Thorne said quietly. "Not because of me. And that's the problem, isn't it? For 20 years I was a good doctor. I saved people. Then little by little I let people buy pieces of me, a signature here, a silence there, and I told myself I was still a good man because I could still save a few lives in the middle of all the filthy things I was doing. Last night, when I stood in that room and realized Vance wanted me to let a 5-year-old child die just to keep a harbor, I saw exactly what I had become." He took a small hard drive and a thick file from inside his jacket, then placed them in Maeve's hands with trembling fingers. "Everything is here," he said. "Every fake invoice I ever signed, every board meeting, every stream of money whose path I know. Enough to bury Vance and everyone like him, and there's this too." He placed another envelope on top, proof that the shipment of medication you were accused of losing never disappeared. It was moved on my order to create a scandal, and you were the one I chose to blame, because you had the least power, the smallest chance of fighting back. I ruined you because you were convenient. And I've lived these past 2 years knowing that." Maeve stood there, holding in her hands the thing that could return everything she had lost. And she realized that the man in front of her wasn't asking her for forgiveness. He knew he had no right. He was only trying to do the right thing one last time before it was too late. "Why?" she asked, her voice tightening in her throat. "Why now?" Thorne looked through the glass window into the room where Greta was sleeping peacefully. "Because she looked at me last night," he said. "Before they took her away, she opened her eyes and looked at me, and she wasn't afraid. She only asked me if I was the person who would make her heart stop hurting, and I realized it had been a very long time since anyone looked at me as if I were still a doctor. I can't save the life I already lost, but I can still keep myself from becoming the man who killed a child." He took one step back and nodded to her, a gesture that was both an apology and a farewell. "I'm turning myself in this morning. I'll testify to everything, including my own part. Take good care of that little girl, Miss Donnelly. And I'm sorry, even though I know those 2 words are worth nothing." Then he turned away and walked out into the dawn courtyard, leaving Maeve standing motionless with the file in her hands, understanding that the circle of cause and consequence had just closed in the strangest way, that the man who had pushed her into darkness was now handing her the light, and saving the very child he had once indirectly threatened. The thing Vance had never calculated, the thing even Connor hadn't calculated at first, was that Maeve had been preparing for this moment and ever since the night her daughter was taken into the enemy's hospital. Because in the instant she saw Wallace Thorne step out from behind the emergency room doors, something inside her changed forever, and she understood that fighting Vance in the dark by Vance's own rules was a war she could never win, because he owned the darkness. The only way to bring down a man who controlled an entire city was to drag him into the light where the whole city could see him, and that light had a name: the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Connor had hesitated, because all his life he had been taught that the federal authorities were the enemy, that one must never invite the wolf into the house. But Maeve had looked at him and said this was no longer his world. This was a staged act of terrorism, a hospital money laundering network, a missing police detective, and those were exactly the things the federal authorities existed to handle. And more important than anything else, this was the only way to save Renata Soto while there was still a chance to save her. So Maeve called. She called the regional office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and when the operator asked what she wanted to report, she took a deep breath and said in a voice that didn't tremble that she had evidence of a plot to use explosives to seize public property, a large-scale money laundering operation through 3 hospitals, and the unlawful detention of a police detective investigating the case. She said she was a direct witness, she had documents, and she was ready to testify publicly under her real name. Within 1 hour, 2 agents were sitting across from her, and what she handed them turned a call that might have sounded like it came from a panicked woman into the starting point of one of the largest cases the office had ever handled. Because Maeve didn't come empty-handed. Arthur Hale, the man who had lived by caution for 30 years, had never trusted a single safe. The safe Vance had emptied contained only 1 copy. But from the beginning, Arthur had backed up everything Desmond confessed, every document they had collected, and hidden it somewhere, even Connor didn't know about, a safe deposit box under a name connected to no one. And he had given Maeve the key to it on the evening before everything collapsed, telling her that if the day ever came when all the men around her fell, this would be the thing that helped her stay standing. Now that backup, combined with the hard drive and file Thorne had just surrendered, combined with Thorne's sworn statement after he turned himself in that morning, had formed a complete picture with no gaps left. Desmond's confession about the bomb, Wendell's technical analysis of the device designed to frame them, Renata's money trail diagram, the fabricated invoices bearing Thorne's signature. Everything fit together like pieces of one machine, and that machine pointed to one man. The agents moved faster than Maeve had dared hope, because the decisive factor that gave them no room to hesitate was a missing police detective, a human life counting down. Based on the clues in Thorne's file about the properties Vance used to hold people, combined with location data the agents were able to trace, a tactical team stormed an abandoned warehouse owned by one of Vance's shell companies that very night, and they found Renata Soto, exhausted, dehydrated, held for days in a windowless room, but alive, still alive. And the first thing she did when the blindfold was removed, and she saw the federal badges, was not cry, but ask in a hoarse voice whether anyone had taken her statement yet, because she had a great deal to say. When the news came back that Renata had been rescued, Maeve sank into the plastic chair in the hospital hallway, pressed the drawing of the orange sun to her chest, and for the first time since that gray Tuesday morning, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they were about to win. Preston Vance wasn't the kind of man who waited for disaster to come find him, and when he realized Thorne had turned himself in and the federal authorities were tightening the circle around him, he did what every man like him does when an empire begins to collapse. He ran to the place where he kept what truly mattered to him, not people but money and the evidence that could bury him. That place was a private warehouse at the very South Harbor he had coveted for so many months, an irony he had no time to recognize. that in the end he had been driven back to the exact piece of land he had meant to steal. Connor knew he would go there, because Connor understood men like Vance, understood that when everything fell apart, their instinct was to protect their secrets at any cost, and he shared this with the federal agents, instead of rushing there himself, a choice he would never have made 6 months earlier. When Vance's convoy rolled into the harbor in the cold gray light of dawn, they didn't find an empty dock where he could clean away the ruins. They found flashing red and blue lights and agents in windbreakers, marked with yellow letters already waiting at every exit. Vance stepped out of the car, and for one moment, Maeve, standing at a distance beside Connor behind the security barrier, finally saw the face of the man who had pulled the strings behind every tragedy in her life. He didn't look like a monster. He looked like any successful businessman. Hair neatly combed, expensive coat, and that was the most frightening thing about him, that the greatest evil often wore the most respectable face. In the final few seconds before he was handcuffed, Vance's eyes swept across the crowd and stopped on Maeve, and he recognized her, the nameless cleaning woman who had brought everything crashing down, and across his face passed the pure confusion of a man who had spent his whole life believing power was the only thing that was real, now defeated by something he had never included in any of his equations, the kindness of a person who had nothing left to lose except her conscience. He said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. The handcuffs spoke for him, and as they read out the long list of charges, conspiracy to commit sabotage with explosives, money laundering, kidnapping a law enforcement officer, bribery, and more, Maeve turned away because she realized she no longer felt hatred. All that remained was a light and hollow relief, the feeling of a burden finally being set down. But the true battle of that day didn't happen at the harbor. It happened in an operating room miles away, where Dr. Bennett and his team spent 6 hours repairing the faulty rhythm Greta had carried with her since birth. Maeve sat in the waiting room through all 6 of those hours, and Connor sat beside her, saying nothing, only being there, steady as a wall. And every time she trembled, his hand gently tightened around hers, a small gesture from a man who had once forgotten how to comfort anyone. When the operating room doors finally opened and Dr. Bennett stepped out with his mask pulled down and a tired smile on his face, he only had to say 3 words. The surgery succeeded, and Maeve collapsed, all the strength that had kept her upright for so many weeks dissolving at once. And she cried in a way she had never allowed herself to cry before. Cried for every night she had stayed awake, for every time she had been afraid alone, for the little girl who would now have a heart beating in the right rhythm and a future Maeve had once believed would always be out of reach. And Connor, the man who had not cried in 6 years and had now cried twice in 1 week, wrapped his arms around her and let her cry against his shoulder. A few weeks later, with Thorne's file, Renata's testimony, and the truth finally brought into the open, the medical board reconvened and officially restored Maeve Donnelly's nursing license, cleared every accusation against her, and sent her a formal apology she knew had come far too late but accepted anyway, not because she needed their apology, but because she needed her daughter to grow up, knowing her mother had never done anything wrong. Spring came late that year, but it truly came, and when the rows of trees along the private road leading to the Fallon mansion began to put out green buds, Connor Fallon did something no one in his world had ever thought possible. He began dismantling the empire he had built with fear, piece by piece, not through collapse but through transformation, turning harbors and shadowed dealings into legal, public businesses, paying full taxes, creating real jobs for real people. He cooperated with the federal authorities within the limits allowed, trading what he knew for a path toward the light. And although that road wasn't easy and wasn't without its cost, for the first time in 6 years, he slept through an entire night without needing to check the locks 3 times. He kept Arthur by his side, no longer as an advisor to a crime boss, but as the father he had almost lost, and he helped Desmond rebuild his life, bringing Hannah safely home, so father and daughter could have the chance to begin again. As for Maeve, she returned to the white coat she had once believed was lost to her forever, working at the very children's hospital where her daughter had been saved. And every shift she took now carried a meaning she had never fully understood before, that to truly see a person, to stay beside them in their darkest hour, was a gentle power more enduring than anything money could buy. Connor and Maeve didn't rush. because both of them had been wounded too deeply to hurry into believing in anything. But the feeling between them grew quietly and surely, like roots sinking deep into the earth, and one afternoon, when Connor came to pick up mother and daughter after Maeve's shift, Greta, now rosy-cheeked and quick on her feet, ran out and took his hand as naturally as if that hand had always belonged to her, then looked up at him and said in her clear little voice that her teacher had asked the class to draw their family, and she had drawn 3 people. Mommy, me, and you, and she asked if it would be all right to call him Daddy, because she had never had a daddy, and he was more like a father than anyone she had ever known, Connor Fallon. The man whose eyes had once been as sad as a teddy bear with one broken eye. The man who had buried his heart for 6 years, knelt down to the child's eye level, and in a voice thick with an emotion he had believed he would never be allowed to feel again. He said yes, that it would be the proudest thing in the world for him, and when he lifted his eyes to Maeve over the little girl's head, their gaze met, carrying everything that didn't need to be spoken aloud. 2 broken people who had found each other in a city that had once taught them invisibility was the safest way to survive, and together they had proven the opposite, that the very moment a person dares to step out of the darkness to be seen, and to see another person, is the moment life truly begins. Maeve had once learned how to read the silence before violence came crashing in, but now she was learning a new language. She was learning how to read peace, and for the first time in her life, she believed she was allowed to keep it. If this story leaves anything behind, perhaps it is this: that power can buy fear but can never buy loyalty, that money can make a person invisible but can never make their worth disappear, and that sometimes the weakest person, the most forgotten person, the one the whole world has grown used to not seeing, is the very one with the strength to change everything, with only one act of kindness, one moment of daring to stop instead of turning away. Kindness isn't weakness. To see and respect the dignity of a human being, whoever they are, wherever they may be in life, is the greatest strength any of us can give away without costing a single cent. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, press the like button, and share this video so we can listen to many more meaningful stories together every day. How do you feel about Maeve and Connor's story? And what part of their journey moved you the most? Please leave a comment below, because we truly hope to hear the feelings that come from deep within your hearts. Thank you for staying with us until the very final moment. May everyone watching this video always have good health, a joyful life, peace, and love filling every day. Goodbye, and we'll see you again in the next videos.